We continue now at the top of Daf 25a Daf and Meseches Menachos. This is Menachos Daf 25a. The Mishnah says, Nitma hakometz, if the kometz becomes tamei, v'hikrivo, and it's offered on the Mizbeach anyhow, hatzitz meratza, then the front plate that is worn by the Kohen Gadol, it affects acceptance, that is accepted as a korban. But yotza, let's say it leaves the proper area of v'hikrivo and it's offered on the Mizbeach, so in that case, ein hatzitz meratza, the tzitz does not cause acceptance, shahatzitz meratza al hatamei, because the tzitz affects acceptance when it comes to tamei, when it comes to impurity, ve'eno meratza al hayotze, but it does not affect acceptance when it comes to that which leaves the proper area. And Rashi explains, hatzitz meratza, the tzitz is meratza, it affects acceptance. V'hamincha kasher, the point over here is that the karma mincha is going to be considered kosher. V'hashirayim nechol, and the remainder of the karma mincha will be eaten. And the Gemara says, Tanu Rabbanan, the sages taught in a brayso, v'nosa Aharon es avon hakadoshim. This is talking about the tzitz being meratza, and it says that Aaron will carry the sin of kodshim. V'chi eza avon hu nosei. Now, what sin is Aaron hakohen carrying? What sin is the tzitz meratza for? Im tomar avon pigul, if you're going to say that it is the sin of pigul, that's intention outside of the proper time. Harei kvar nemar lo yechoshev. It already says that it's not going to be credited. Im tomar avon noser, if you're going to say it's the sin of noser, that which is left beyond the proper time, Harei kvar nemar lo yerotz, it already says that's not going to be accepted. Ha'eno nosei ela avon tuma, rather it only carries the sin of tuma, shehutra michlala b'tzibur, because we find that tuma is hutra michlala b'tzibur, is permitted, even though in general tuma is not permitted when it comes to kachim, but b'tzibur, in communal situations, there are situations where it is permitted. And Rashi explains, ha'eno nosei ela avon tuma, it is going to carry the burden of tuma, hoel v'yesh bot tzad kal, because there is something lenient about tuma. And what is it that is lenient about tuma? Shehutra michlala b'tzibur. It's hutra michlala b'tzibur dechsib b'tamid, because it's written by the carbon tamid. B'moado, it says that it's brought in its time. Afilu b'tuma, even b'tuma. So we see that tuma is hutra michlala b'tzibur from the carbon tamid. And the Gemara continues, Maskef lo Rabbi Zera. Rabbi Zera asks the following question: Ema avon yotze. Maybe we should say that it carries the sin of yotze, again that which leaves the proper area. Shehutra michlala b'bama, because there also we find the heter, we find the permissibility by bama. And Rashi explains, michlalo b'bama, we find that it's permitted by bama, that's by a private altar. Michlalo shenesar yotze b'mishkan. What that means is, in general, there is a prohibition by the Mishkan. Yotze was not allowed, but hutter b'bamos nov v'givon. But in nov and givon, bamos were allowed, the ein sham kloim, because there were no curtains at that time. V'yotze denesar b'mishkan. Now, the fact that yotze is usher in the times of the Mishkan, mefarish b'keitzat solin, that's explained in Keitzat Solin and Meseches Psachim. Mikra, that's from a pasuk, Madua lo achalta mesachatos b'makom hakodesh. And so in any case, again, the Gemara is asking, why don't we say that the tzitz is meratza in terms of yotze? And the Gemara continues, Amar le Abaya, Abaya said to him, he said to Rabbi Zera, Amar Kra, the pasuk says, L'rotzon lohem lifnei Hashem. It says lifnei Hashem. We understand that to mean avon de lifnei Hashem. It's specifically a sin that's lifnei Hashem. In yes, that's where we say that tzitz is meratza. But avon de yotze, but if it's a sin that's not lifnei Hashem, like yotze, where it goes outside of the proper place, so low, so there, no, we do not say that it affects acceptance. And the Gemara continues, Maskef lo Rabbi Law. Rabbi Law asks the following question: Ema avon smol. Why don't we say that the sin that it carries, that the tzitz is meratza for, is a sin if it's done in the left hand when it's supposed to be done with the right hand? And where do we find a leniency, a heter over there? Shehuter michlalo b'yom kippur, and we find that the left hand is permitted in certain circumstances on Yom Kippur. And Rashi explains, Ve'ema avon smol, we should say the sin of the left hand, the lechatchila ba'inon yamin, because lechatchila, really the right hand is supposed to be used. Kedamrinan beparak rishon, like we said in the first parak of this Masechta, kol makom shenamar etzba, anytime it says etzba, again it's referring to the right. And we find a permission for the left hand, b'yom hakippur, man yom kippur, not alas hamachta b'yamino, it says the machta is taken in the right hand, v'yas hakaf b'smolu, and the spoon with the incense, the Kohen Gadol takes with the left hand, so we find that the left hand is used. And the Gemara continues, Amar le Abaya, Abaya said to him, he said to Rabbi Law, Amar Kra, the pasuk says, Avon, it says a sin, Avon shahaya bo udechisiv, that means there was a sin that was pushed off. La'afuka Yom HaKippurim, that comes to exclude Yom Kippur. Tehechshero b'smolhu, really, l'chatzchila, that part is supposed to be done with the left hand, and so therefore we're not referring to that. Rashi explains, Amar Kra Avon, the pasuk says Avon, V'nosa Aharon es Avon, again it says that Aaron will carry the burden of the sin. Mashma sheyesh bo Avon lechatchila b'chol makom. That's understood to mean that there was a sin in general. V'dachisi la'avon b'tzibur, but I've pushed off that sin in communal situations, mipnei kavod tzibur, because of the honor of the community, and b'yachid, and in such a situation, by a yachid, by a private individual, hatzitz meratza, that tzitz will affect acceptance. La'afuke, small, that comes to exclude the left hand. De'ein ba shum avon, there's no sin involved at all. Tahachiu hechsher mitzvah, so that's the proper way to do the mitzvah. And the Gemara continues, Rav Ashi says the reason why it can't be the left hand that the tzitz is meratza for is because Avon HaKadoshim, Aaron is carrying the sin of Kodshim, velo Avon HaMakdishim, not the sin of the Makdishim, of those who are offering the Karbonos. And Rashi explains, Rav Ashi says, Lo motzis amrit, tzitz meratza al Avon small. You can't say that the tzitz is affecting acceptance on the sin of the left hand. Diamar kra Avon HaKodshim velo Makdishim, it says Kodshim and not Makdishim, and that means Avon hatoloi bekohanim shechayovin lavod ulakadesh kometz biyamin va'avdo b'smol. If it's a sin that has to do with the kohanim, not the carbon itself, the kohanim are supposed to do the avodah and sanctify with the right hand, and instead va'avdo b'smol, instead they do it with the left. Eino no say, that kind of sin is not being carried by the tzitz. And the Gemara continues, Amar le Rav Sima bereder Rav Idi Rav Ashi. Rav Sima, the son of Rav Idi, said to Rav Ashi, V'amri lo, some have the version as follows, Rav Sima bereder Rav Ashi le Rav Ashi. Rav Sima, the son of Rav Ashi, said to Rav Ashi, Ve'ema avon balmum, why don't we say that the tzitz is meratza for the sin of blemishes, shehuter michlolo ba'ofos, because we find that by birds, that's permitted. There is no issue of blemishes by birds. The Amar Mar, because the master said, Tamus v'zachrus bebehema, the requirements of tamus, which mean no blemishes, and zachrus, which means it has to be a male animal, those kinds of requirements only apply by animals. Ve'ein tamus v'zachrus ba'ofos, the requirements of tamus and zachrus, they don't apply by birds, and so maybe it's the sin of mum that is carried by the tzitz, that the tzitz is meratza for. Amar le, he said to him, Alecha Amar Kra, to you the pasuk says, responds, Lo yeratza, it says Lo yeratza, ki lo l'ratzon yelachem, when it comes to mum, that is not accepted, the pasuk stresses that, and therefore that cannot be what the tzitz is meratza for. And Rashi explains, Lo yeratza b'shor v'ses sarua v'kolot, again it's talking there about blemishes by the animals. Lo l'ratzon kol asher bo mum lo sakrivu, again it's not going to be accepted blemishes, and so therefore again based on that pasuk we know that is not what the tzitz is meratza for. And the Gemara continues at the two dots, Tanu Rabbanan, the sages taught in a brisa, Dam shenitma, if blood becomes tamei vizarku, and it is thrown, b'shogeg hurtza, b'mezid lo hurtza, if it's by mistake, then it's accepted. If it's on purpose, then it is not accepted. Rashi here explains, V'hai shogeg umezid, when it says over here shogeg and mezid, mefarish l'kamon ahaya, it's going to be explained later on, ahaya koi, what it's going on, iya zriko, iya tum, is it going on the zriko or the tum? It says here, Dam shenitma vizarku, you have blood that became tummy and it was thrown, and then it talks about b'shogeg and b'mezid. Are we going on the tumah being b'shogeg or b'mezid? Are we going on the zrika, the throwing of the blood, being b'shogeg and b'mezid? That's going to be discussed. And the brisa continues, B'amed devarim amurim. Now, when is this true b'yachid? This is all true by an individual. In other words, dam shenitma v'zarku b'shogeg hurtza b'mezid lo hurtza is by an individual. Avol b'tzibor, but by the community, bein b'shogeg, bein b'mezid hurtza, whether it's b'shogeg or b'mezid, it will be accepted. Ovid kochavim, and by an ovid kochavim, by an idol worshipper, bein b'shogeg, bein b'mezid, bein ba'ones, bein b'ratzon, by a non-Jew, whether it's b'shogeg, whether it's b'mezid, whether it's ba'ones, whether it's b'ratzon. And Rashi explains, ovid kochavim sheshilech karbono. The brisa here is talking about an ovid kochavim, a non-Jew who sends his carbon, v'nitma hadam, and the blood becomes tamei. Damrinon beperak elo menachos, we say in perak elo menachos later on, ish mi beis Yisrael, asher yakriv karbono matamad lomar ish. Why does it say ish in the pasuk? L'rabo says ovdei kochavim, that includes ovdei kochavim, shenodrin nedarim unedavos k'Yisrael. They can donate nedarim and nedavos offerings just like a Yisrael, and we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Chafhei Amud Beis.